The Parable of the True Science of Life. It is said that in a city among cities, where all the sciences were taught, there lived a young man who was handsome and studious. And although nothing was lacking in the happiness of his life, he was possessed by the desire to always learn more. Now it was revealed to him one day, thanks to the story of his traveling merchant, that there existed in a very distant country a scholar who was the holiest man in Islam, and who possessed in himself as much science, wisdom, and virtue as all the scholars of the century put together. And he learned that this scholar, despite his fame, simply practiced the trade of blacksmith that his father and grandfather had practiced before him. And having heard these words, he returned to his house, took his sandals, his bag, and his staff, and immediately left his city and his friends. He went to the distant land where the holy master lived, in order to place himself under his tutelage, and to acquire some of his knowledge and wisdom. And he walked for 40 days and 40 nights, and after much danger and fatigue, he arrived, thanks to the security that Allah wrote to him, in the city of the blacksmith. And he went immediately to the souk of the blacksmiths, and presented himself to the one whose shop all the passers-by had pointed out to him. After kissing the hem of his robe, he humbly stood before him. And the smith, who was an old man, with a face bearing the holy mark, asked him, "What do you desire, my son?" He answered, "To know." And the smith, for an answer, put the bellows rope into his hand and told him to pull. The new disciple heard and obeyed, and immediately began to pull and release the bellows rope without cease from the moment of his arrival until sunset. And the next day he performed the same task, as well as the following days, for weeks, months, and a whole year, without anyone in the smithy, not even the master or the many disciples who had each a task as hard as himself, speaking to him once, and without anyone complaining or even murmuring about this hard, silent work. And 5 years passed in this way, and the disciple one day very timidly ventured to open his mouth and said, "Master." And the blacksmith stopped his work, and all the disciples did the same, though with anxiety. And in the silence of the forge, he turned to the young man and asked him, "What do you want?" He said, "Knowledge." And the blacksmith said, "Draw the rope." And without another word, he resumed the work of the forge. And 5 more years passed, during which time the disciple pulled the bellows cord from morning to night, without respite, and without anyone speaking to him once. But if any of the disciples needed an answer to a question of any kind, he was free to write the request and present it to the master in the morning when he entered the forge. And the master, without ever reading the writing, either threw it into the fire of the forge or put it in the folds of his turban. If he threw the writing into the fire, it was, without doubt, because the request was not worth an answer. But if the paper was placed in the turban, the disciple who had presented it found in the evening the master's answer written in gold characters on the wall of his cell. When 10 years had passed, the old blacksmith approached the young man and touched him on the shoulder. "What have you learned of the science of life?" the old man asked. "To draw the rope," replied the young man. Suddenly, a great joy descended upon him, and for the first time in 10 years, he let go of the bellows of the forge. And the master spoke to him, saying, "My son, you can return to your country and your home with all the knowledge of the world in your heart. For this you have attained by acquiring the virtue of endeavor." And he gave him the kiss of peace, and the disciple returned to his country, enlightened to the joy of life.